Hello and welcome. I'm Shelby Magid, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you so much for joining us for our event today, titled By Air and by Sea, What Does the Spring Hold for Ukraine? We're joined by some fantastic experts to discuss the latest in the war in Ukraine, and it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. We're joined by Dr. Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute, Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Dr. Ara Sabados, Senior Journalist at Independent Commodity Intelligence Services, and last but not least, Minister Andrei Zakharnyuk, Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, Chairman of the Center for Defense Strategies, and a former Minister of Defense of Ukraine. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to start off with questions to the panelists and then move to audience questions. If you have a question at any time, please visit askac.org, and I'll pitch your questions to our panel. Again, that is askac.org to submit your questions. Minister Zakharnyuk, we'll start with you. Some commentators claim the war is now at a stalemate, and with the delay in U.S. aid, Ukraine is in danger of losing significant territory in the months to come. Can you tell us what the current state of the battlefield is? Just unmute first.
Sorry, yes, sorry.
No problem, thanks.
Yes, the current state, of course, is extremely tense. Stalemate, we can see this perhaps from some sort of strategic position, but in operational areas, it's full of action. And for example, our center is publishing daily reports from the front line, which are free to subscribe in Substack, as you may know. So yesterday, for example, we had 85 combat engagements throughout the 85 attempts of Russians to offend, which were repelled by Ukrainian forces. So we have tens of substantial engagements on all different parts of the front line. Of course, they are progressing a little bit right now based on the fact that we have a substantial disbalance of the firepower. But this progress is quite limited. So we're talking about hundreds of meters, sometimes like a couple kilometers in some areas. But nevertheless, right now Russians are paying a massive attention and massive efforts to use that. As we understand, they see this as a temporary situation, but nevertheless, a situation of the lack of ammunition in Ukraine and lack of the capabilities in Ukraine, respective lack of capabilities in Ukraine, and in order to kind of push to push their forces as much as possible. Ukraine repels most of these attacks. Sometimes, as I said, there's some movements, and these movements are happening in all parts of the front. We have to say that Russians right now are, like for instance, again, from our yesterday's report, one of Russian units have lost 85% of the personnel after this offensive operation. So the strategy is that they are ready to pay any price, using that window of opportunity to advance as much as possible. We know that they are increasing as much as possible. They're increasing the production of the weapons, the production of the ammunition. Their production works much more effective than it used to be in the previous months. Not talking about the 2022 or even beginning of 2023. So it's a totally different type of the manufacturing. So they're supplying their lines with a very well set up logistical schemes and the production and the manufacturing production units. However, if we look at and we're working on this study right now, which I'm happy to share later. If we look at the armored vehicles, that we see the dynamic is rather negative still for Russia. So they're losing more than they produce, which means that if they sustain that sort of level of losses over the let's say a year, I don't think they will be in a position of keeping that with that sort of intensity. However, of course, they're planning to increase that as well. There is some substantial, let's say, skepticism of certain people who are currently doing these studies about that, how actually they can grow production further, because they also have some substantial bottlenecks. Unfortunately, the expected bottlenecks, like sanctions, for example, they don't work as much as we wanted. But nevertheless, there's still engineering bottlenecks and production bottlenecks, so they cannot like easily double again their production. But they're trying. So nevertheless, of course, what we see right now has been substantially impacted by the technological different changes in the war. Ukraine currently holds positions predominantly because of the role of the drones in the battlefield, which we see right now occupying pretty much a leading position. And I you know I wouldn't even dare to to forecast what would have happened if we didn't have those drones, because right now the quantity of weapons coming from the West sometimes are extremely low. We do have we'll do look with some optimism and some of the projects. As you know, there's European supplies which are upcoming. So generally, we do expect some growth of the ammunition on the front. But of course, without the U.S. decision, which is currently, as we know, where it is, it's still going to be extremely tough. We nevertheless, Ukraine is rather successful in stabilizing the front in most of the areas. In certain areas, Ukraine has initiative. And what we know is that with the drone production and with the generally with the development of drone capability, Ukraine is getting more and more of the like sort of leadership position. And the prognosis for this year, at least for the next half a year, is that Ukraine would substantially grow its presence with the drones, and that would stop Russians from being able to move. The only problem is that, as we know, recently Russia announced about the further growth of the force structure, which means that almost inevitably we're talking about mobilization, and in which case we will have just a sheer number of soldiers to deal with, growing quite substantially. That's basically a strategic risk for later this year, very, very substantial. Otherwise, right now, immediate situation is, of course, there's the hunger of the weapons, which we need to deal somehow with, because unless we resolve that, everything else would be basically survival. Thank you.
Thank you very much for laying that all out for us. And as you mentioned, drones, I will now turn to Dr. Savagis. Ukraine has conducted a dozen or so successful drone strikes on Russian hydrocarbon facilities, especially oil refineries, as far as 2,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Bloomberg reported that this has had a notable impact on Russia's supply of refined oil. What damage has this new drone campaign done, and what is the impact on the Russian economy and their military campaign?
Thank you very much, and apologies for earlier. I had this small disconnection, so I hope that the connection will be stable. We had the storm here. Regarding your question, and I think these are very pertinent. This is a very pertinent question. Ukraine has been striking oil depots and refineries for the last couple of months, but we've seen really an intensification in the campaign, in the strikes, particularly in March. One difficulty that we have is the fact that Russia is not publishing data, stopped publishing oil relevant data immediately after the war. So we have to rely on estimates, on forecasts, etc. But to my calculations, around 15% of the capacity, refining capacity of the Russian refining capacity has been damaged or affected. Now, Russia has around 30 large refineries and another dozen of smaller refineries. And of these, what we know is that around 13 larger refineries have been struck and 2 smaller ones. If we refer to the actual capacity, processing capacity, that's around, I would say, up to 1 million barrel per day. But figures vary. As I said, we rely on estimates, and the figures I've seen were between 500 to up to 500,000 up to 1 million. And we also have to make a distinction between the actual processing capacity and the actual volumes that have been affected. And as I understand, there has been a slack in the processing capacity prior to the start of the strikes, which means that refining capacity in Russia was working at around 65 to 70%. So to go back to the question that you asked, what sort of impact has this had in terms of the economy, but also the strategic and perhaps even psychological aspect? I would say that on the economic front, we have a couple of angles here. First of all, is the fact that some of these refineries, like the big one, the North Sea refinery that belongs to Lukoil, at least one of the larger units has been damaged, severely damaged, as I understand. And of course, there are also sanctions in place, which means that this capacity will be offline for a longer period of time. In terms of actual bans, Russia introduced a diesel ban in September, but very interestingly, Deputy Minister Novak said that he's not interested in, so that ban was lifted, and this year he said that there won't be any bans happening. What he did say, and what they did do, was introduce a ban on gasoline 2 weeks before the elections. Now, I believe that this was largely done to protect the local population from a rise in internal prices. So to a certain extent, the price of refined products in Russia has gone up, but it's debatable to what extent the price has gone up because of the drone strikes or because of the wider picture, and I'll come back to this, regarding actual oil prices. We do see, however, a drop in exports for diesel, for example. It fell in March, and it's expected to fall in April. There is also the question of revenue, and very interestingly, because the price of oil has gone up, this has also contributed to an increase in revenue in March compared to the previous months. But again, I believe this is linked to the wider macroeconomic picture. There's also the strategic aspect, and I think here it's very important to discuss the air defenses, because I think that Russia has exactly the same issues that Ukraine has in terms of protecting the infrastructure, and refineries being such large structures, flammable, and pretty much undefended. These are very easy targets. So this is in terms of the strategic aspect. I would also say that there is also a psychological impact, perhaps, because through these drone strikes, Ukraine actually brought the specter of war closer to Russians, to ordinary Russians. They see the fires, they see the attacks. So they probably begin to finally realize that this is not a special operation; it's actual war. But we can come back to the issue of oil prices.
Thank you very much. Dr. Farkas, the Financial Times reported that U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan visited Kyiv at the end of March, while you and Ambassador Herbst were also there, and allegedly asked the Ukrainians to stop the attacks on Russian oil refineries in order to avoid a spike in global oil prices. What do you make of this report?
Well, first, thank you very much, Shelby, Ambassador Herbst, for convening this and for inviting me to participate, and also for inviting me to travel with you and participate in the Kyiv Security Forum. Look, I think that clearly the attacks on the oil refineries, as we've just heard, have had an impact domestically inside of Russia. And the psychological impact, of course, is not limited purely to Russia. The Ukrainians have benefited from the psychological reaction. They have seen their spirits buoyed at a time when they are not making great advances on the ground. Although there is a lot to be said about the maritime domain, and I'll say a few words about that in a second. But with regard to the attacks, I do think that that our government, we don't know, that our government has not confirmed whether they have given a message to the Ukrainians to cease these kinds of attacks on the oil refineries. But I think that it would be wise for our government not to jump to conclusions, as we've just heard, that attacking these refineries are so directly linked to the price of oil, to the international price of oil. And clearly, it's also a double-edged sword, because again, as we just heard from our expert on energy, the price of oil will go up. So it's not necessarily robbing Russia of revenue. I think the more important component of this is the psychological, number one, and number two. We also heard mention of this, I think in our last speaker mentioned the fact that the Lukoil refinery has been damaged and it will be down for a while because the vulnerability that the Russians really have has to do with the ability to repair such facilities. And this extends beyond actually the oil and gas industry, where we have known for a long time the first round of sanctions when I was in the Obama administration were leveled at the oil and gas industry to prevent new Western technology or Western technology from being provided to the Russian oil and gas industry, meaning that if they suffered from any sorts of damage, we would no longer be giving them our state-of-the-art tools and other components that they need to refurbish their oil and gas industry, which, as we know, of course, does provide very necessary revenue to the Russians. But it's not just the oil and gas industry that has this vulnerability. A recent piece in The Economist focused entirely on the fact that Russians may be running low on artillery gun barrels, and that these artillery gun barrels are manufactured with tools, again, Western technology, that the Russians need to access from the outside world. So I think that the strikes on the refineries, I think our government should not overreact. These are clearly militarily viable targets, but at the same time, they're not going to be necessarily the game changer, especially if we don't ratchet up export controls, targeting those third parties that are providing this kind of non-military but dual-use technologies that, of course, we're not supposed to be providing to Russia. So I would say that the more important component of this is really to focus on export controls. And then, frankly, if we're in a position right now where we have not provided Ukraine with the necessary weapons that they need to change the situation on the ground, I don't think we should be tying the Ukrainians' hands behind their backs with kind of advice that we really haven't even ourselves digested in terms of having real, energy economists and macroeconomic experts doing an assessment. So I guess I'm skeptical that our government has done that kind of detailed work to assess exactly, how this will impact the price of oil. So that's my somewhat long-winded answer. And the one other thing I want to say is that I think it does bear mentioning that the Ukrainians have been really good at taking the war behind the lines to the Russians, and it also happens in the maritime domain. We know that the Russians have opened up the sea corridor on the Ukrainians have opened up the sea corridor from the Black Sea to international markets again, and they've done that using, of course, the Storm Shadow military equipment that the UK and others have provided, longer range weaponry, but they also have used their own sea drone capabilities, and this is getting behind the current lines. Of course, it's Ukrainian territory in Crimea, Ukrainian maritime territory, but nevertheless, they're getting behind Russian lines right now. So I think it's important for us not to discourage Ukraine from taking these kinds of military, tactical, and operational measures, because they are significant psychologically, and over time, they can also change the calculus if we ratchet up export controls as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Evelyn. Ambassador Herbst, I've got a question for you, but first, do you want to react to the question about Jake Sullivan?
I would just say that Evelyn's response was exactly right. But since she's nice, she did not go to the punch. I would say my reaction is, what type of chutzpah is this to ask for that when we're not providing Ukraine the weapons they need? So I'm ready for your next question.
Okay, well, that ties to the next question. So you were just in Kyiv along with Evelyn and I, and there are many reports that Ukraine is deeply concerned about this aid delay. Can you tell us what the state of play is with the aid package, and also what impact is this delay having on Ukraine and how the U.S. is perceived in Europe and beyond?
All right. I think Minister Zaharanuk made the critical point about the impact of the aid delay on the battlefield. That aid delay plus the timidity of the United States and other countries in sending air power to Ukraine probably together explain the Russian success in taking Avdiivka, although a very, very costly success for the Russians. As for the aid package, I've been saying since December, Ukraine would get aid. It would take 2+ months. I've said that in September. I said that a few weeks ago in Kyiv, actually even 2 weeks ago in Kyiv. I think we're actually at the point where it's probably going to happen within 2 months or even a little bit less. Speaker Johnson, who I think would like to provide the aid but is afraid of losing his job by providing aid, said last night that they're going to move an aid package when they come back into session next week. But he also talked about various elements of a package which suggest it may not happen overnight. Talking again about the border, as well as the other constituent parts of the aid package, meaning for Israel and Taiwan. And as long as there's not real clarity on the package, the chances of getting it done are pushed off into the future. But Johnson has a problem, which may also be a solution. If he doesn't put the package on the floor, there are enough Republicans and a whole lot of Democrats who will sign a discharge petition. And they've made clear their intention to do this. So I think if we don't see clear movement by the Speaker in 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to see the emergence of a discharge petition around the package, which will have enough votes. First they'll sign the petition and put it on the floor, and then there'll be a large majority that supports it. So I think we will probably see this done. I'm not going to say this month in April, but in May. I think there's a good chance it'll get done. And if that happens, that will be soon enough to prevent disaster in Ukraine. And that's very important. But you also asked about the impact of the delay in aid, and for that matter, the timidity of the Biden administration in sending the more advanced weapons, what impact that's having on U.S. leadership. And sadly, it's having a great deal of impact. You have European leaders talking about, well, can we trust the United States going forward? That comment has also been made frequently in Ukraine, but it's much wider. We're hearing it much more widely than just in Ukraine. And of course, there's concern about what will happen after our next presidential election, but maybe we can leave that for another day's conversation. So American leadership as well requires us to get this aid package done. And I think we will probably make it happen, but after far too much delay. It's now 6 months. It's now 6 months. Okay, I think that's it.
Thank you. And Minister Zakharnout, did you want to add to that?
I'm finding very difficult to keep calm and professional verbiage when I'm discussing these things, to be honest. I mean, because it's extremely frustrating what's happening, and I think this is a historical, how you say, a strategic mistake by US, one of US largest political parties and one of the greatest political parties in the world, a mistake of historical proportions. I think that US is clearly losing the. So let me say two things. First of all, US is losing authority in Europe, like tremendously, and many people don't say that loud when with the US delegations in the room, but they say it very openly without US delegations in the room. I participated in several strategic sessions with the analysts and the government members of the European nations, and in every single of them, there was a question on the table: how to wake up Europe in the absence of United States as a leader of the coalition. So you just need to realize that whoever is watching us right now, that it's not like Europe is blind, and it's not like people is not understanding what's happening. What's happening is the inability to pass the decision, which everybody in there, from a position of common sense, understand that what's happening in Ukraine is terrible, and that something needs to be done. And clearly, there is a paralysis of the power to make a decision and send these weapons. So from that perspective, maybe it's good that Europe is waking up. I mean, because Europe was sleeping for a while, you know. So for them, from that position, is actually a positive development. But it's absolutely not characterizing United States government as a whole in a positive manner, because Europe is waking up, because they clearly see that, for instance, in the Ramstein meetings, there's been constant. The Ramstein format generally was set up as the format, as a forum where United States has a like a seats at the head of the table in all matter, like literally and also by the way it operates, you know. So basically, it's been led by United States as the biggest donor, as the most sort of passionate donor and strategically minded donor back in the day when it started in 2022. Right now, Europeans are talking about setting up new formats by saying that United States cannot play that role anymore, simply because they already walked away from their support. So I don't know what US is going to do about that, but that's what's happening. So that's the first problem. Second problem is that I have friends, lots of friends currently in the front, like as we speak, and I speak to some of them on a sort of almost daily basis and travel around the Ukraine, different places, let's put it this way, and I have calls from, and just recently spoke to the guy who participated in rationing of the cartridges, you know. So they're basically saying, okay, so this is 5 to these guys, 6 to these guys, and so on. Clearly understanding that they're basically surviving and losing positions, losing people, and so on. And how many people will lose when we will be trying to get back what been lost today? It's very difficult to explain. I hate to be ungrateful to the Western coalition, and particularly US, for the hundreds of billions of help which has been provided so far, because we are grateful and we understand that what saved the country. But right now, there's a massive confusion in Ukrainian circles of people who basically care what's happening, about what's happening between US and Ukraine, because they don't know how to explain this anymore. And yes, there is explanation about some internal matters and so on, but we're talking about, as ambassadors, at 6 months. During these 6 months, there's lots of things happened, and lots of things will happen during the next couple of months until we're getting something. So we're actually not even playing with fire. We are playing with the strategic consequences of historical proportions, and I don't think that we are demonstrating right now some sort of enough responsibility for that. So whatever, I mean, I'm obviously not talking to the panel, because panel is doing miracles in order to to actually turn things. But whoever is watching right now, it's not a joke, and we're in a very serious situation. Thank you.
Thank you for adding that. I think those are really critical points. Ambassador Herbst, Dr. Farkas, does this track with what you heard from others in Ukraine?
This is certainly the view of virtually all Ukrainians with whom we spoke. And it's hard to overemphasize it. But as Andriy pointed out, it's also the talk of Europe. I mean, I should have mentioned in my answer earlier that France, which likes to tweet the United States, is now speaking about taking steps to help Ukraine, including putting troops in Ukraine, because it sees a vacuum. And that's a vacuum wholly of our own making. This is principally, of course, a problem created by a certain group of Republicans in the House of Representatives. But the fear is this is a problem that's not going to go away, even though I do expect it to get resolved. So American leadership is certainly at stake. We can recover. There's no doubt we can recover. We've recovered from missteps in the past, but we need to recover soon, and we need to recover strong. And it would be useful if we were, for our recovery, if both the White House and senior Republicans were to make clear to the American people that Russia behaves as if we are their principal adversary or enemy. And, last night, again, I was listening to Speaker Johnson talking about the aid package, and he talked about how we have to contain or manage China. but he said nothing about containing or managing Russia. This on the day there was a spectacular report fingering the Russians as behind the Havana Syndrome, targeting American officials, completely maliciously, targeting them in Europe, in Lithuania at the NATO summit, in the United States, for crying out loud. We need clarity from our leadership that Moscow is a danger to the United States. Then the issue of sending aid to Ukraine would be less controversial, when it should not be controversial at all.
And I'll also add to this that the argument that, I mean, this is not only obviously impacting US influence, we still have power, but our influence is eroded. It's also, frankly, demonstrating some of the weaknesses in our democracy. We have a fringe group in one party that is holding up the entire foreign policy of the United States, which the majority of our political establishment, including, of course, our president, is eager to continue to advance. So that doesn't put us in the best light. And I would also point out that these far-right folks are using the same language that the Kremlin uses when it comes to where we stand in the current war of aggression against Ukraine, which is to say that they are often saying that, well, Ukraine is losing anyway. And I have a piece in the, sorry, I have to promote this, in The Hill today, where I make very clear arguments about why there's cause for optimism. Ukraine is not losing. Ukraine is still winning. We happen to just be in a very difficult situation right now, but there are very good reasons to believe that Ukraine can and will win soon, provided, of course, that they continue to get military assistance, whether it's from us or from the Europeans. From us would be ideal, but there are reasons for optimism. The morale, you know, the former minister mentioned the rationing, but nevertheless, what I heard from journalists, these are Western journalists, but they sent their Ukrainian colleagues out to the front line, and they say that morale is holding, even though there's this rationing. Ukrainians are continuing to fight. They understand they have to do what they have to do. So that's a cause for optimism. Second, I already mentioned the fact that the Russians do not have the Western technology and the tools they need to refurbish in cases where they are running out of ammunition or running out of gun stocks, or where their refineries have been damaged. In addition to that, the maritime domain means that Ukraine is getting access to new revenue and is trading normally through the Black Sea. And then on top of that is the $330 billion, which, you know, John, Ambassador Herbst, Shelby, and I had a lot of conversations on the sidelines in Kyiv with folks about that money looks like it will be made available to Ukraine in the next year. And if that does happen, that will be a game changer as well. So Ukraine is not losing, and we should not indulge such rhetoric. And more of us need to be making the case loudly that Ukraine is indeed winning, and we need to back the winning team, and we need to do it fast so that we can cut the cost in lives and in money and material.
Well said. And then just to clarify, that money that you mentioned, that is the Russian sovereign frozen assets, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, thanks, Shelby.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, keeping up with the Russian economy, we're going to pivot back to you, Dr. Sabotis. On another note, and as you mentioned earlier, some observers cite statistics from the IMF and other IFIs saying that Russia's economy grew at 3% last year and claim that sanctions are not working and or need to be tightened. Others claim those estimates are suspect because they use Russian government statistics. Can you talk about your thoughts on the Russian economy with the impact of sanctions?
Sure. I would say that immediately after the cap and ban sanctions were introduced on oil and oil products at the end of 2022 and beginning of last year, so in the first half of last year, we actually did see a drop in revenues. But from the second half of the year, because of lack of enforcement, actually Russia started to increase exports, and even in defiance of the cap. What we also saw was a so-called laundromat where even though G7 countries said we're not going to import oil or refined products, they actually started to take these refined products from countries where Russia sent oil and where these products were refined. And I'm talking here about countries like Turkey, India, China, even Bulgaria. After that, so the end of last year, a new package of sanctions sanctions were actually secondary sanctions were introduced. And banks have now stricter control. So they are trying to put in place stricter control. I'm talking here particularly about banks in the UAE or Turkey and China. And we do see a drop in revenue. But at the same time, as I said earlier, the price of oil is going up. We still have questions on whether this cap is enforced. So we're talking here a cap of $60 for oil and $100 for refined products, $45 for heavier fuel oil. And there is still a possibility to bypass these sanctions. And we haven't spoken about gas, but gas is also a big area of concern because gas is not sanctioned. So imports of natural gas, with the exception of the UK and Lithuania, which banned LNG, liquefied natural gas, there are still lots of companies that are taking the gas. And I work in the industry. I speak to companies on a regular basis, and trust me, there is a keen desire to go back to business as usual. And there is absolutely no sign that exports of gas would be banned. The Ukrainian transit contract is coming to an end, expires this year. Of course, Ukrainian officials said that they don't want to that they are not going to negotiate with the Russians. But there is also pressure from companies such as OMV in Austria or SPP in Slovakia, Ustream, the gas grid operator, and they all see an opportunity there. I was at the Shippers Forum very recently, and I was amazed to see the level of interest in going back to business as usual. So this is the situation right now, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. Minister Zaharnyuk, during the end of March, Moscow amped up its air assault on Ukrainian infrastructure and civilians. Aside from the human toll, perhaps, but most notable was the strike on the dam in Dnipro and on the Dnipro River. What has the impact been, and what does Ukraine need to deal with this latest threat? Also, what is the strategic purpose of the drone campaign against Russian hydrocarbon assets?
The strategic purpose is quite straightforward. It's to deprive Russia from being able to support their offensive campaigns. Indeed, there's been a serious disruption of the oil production, oil products production in Russia, and the extension of that would certainly create problems for fueling tanks and other vehicles and other capabilities which Russia has and tries to use against Ukraine. And also of course the economic impact, which was discussed already. So basically all of those are used directly for the army purposes, so they are legally legitimate targets. And Russia currently, we cannot connect Russian activities with Ukrainian activities because it's again, Russia very much likes to use this as a narrative, saying that they do something in response. And that's extremely dangerous narrative because it's because you will never end up with any constructively where like how the responses started. What started was the full-scale invasion, and then whatever Ukraine is doing is in order to prevent that the growth of that full-scale invasion, because Russia is actively pushing the idea of the fact that Ukraine shouldn't exist or all other its strategic purposes. So despite the setbacks over 2022 and 2023, Russia still keeps the strategic purposes of this war intact. So essentially what we try to do is we try to keep the country, to fight for the survival of the country and to stop that assault somehow, and hopefully to turn it back and keep on pushing Russians out. We are succeeding, as you know, very much in the maritime domain. And whoever doesn't know from the audience, I have to say that currently we have a much smaller presence of Russia in the Black Sea. It's still there. So currently every day there is a ship in the like a caliber missiles carrying ships in the Black Sea, but that's already much less than it used to be. And we're working on the future situation when Russia will not have a Black Sea fleet, and we will stop when Russia will stop having a Black Sea fleet, and then we will raise the question of that if we want a freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, Russia should not have naval capabilities there at all, because it cannot be a responsible neighbor. And it cannot be a responsible, I don't know, a country with such regime, and as such, it should be deprived from using a naval capabilities in the Black Sea. Otherwise, we're not going to have any freedom of navigation, any peace in the Black Sea. So, but coming back to the land, they still obviously trying to push, as we discussed before, and we're going to do whatever is necessary for them to stop. And most of these drone campaigns are actually what's saving the country from the bigger, much bigger problems. So let's be. I have to say, if I can comment, I was shocked to hear, and of course, it's not the first time we hear that so many large companies in Europe are trying to get back to the business as usual with Russia. That's why we need to qualify Russian government as criminal, because every time when we delay with that, every time when we keep on saying that yes, it's not terrorism, oh no, this is not a crime against humanity, these are not war crimes because they're still not qualified by the designated tribunal, and so on and so on. We are just simply giving the reason for many of the business people who are cynical because they are seeing the world in a different way, and we're not going to change that reality. So we need to present them with the reality that dealing with terrorists is illegal. We need to present them with reality that dealing with the criminal state is illegal. That's what we need to do. And delaying that is clearly in the hands of the key governments, which are simultaneously allies of Ukraine. Why are we still not having that tribunal? Why still there are no legal qualifications of what has been done? So I think that delaying that is actually providing some of the companies just like we kind of bring them on a plate, the idea that someday these miraculous negotiations are going to happen, which are pretty fanciful because you cannot negotiate with the person who wants to kill you. I mean, there's just like there's no zone of possible agreement about that. You cannot be killed like 50% or something. If somebody wants to kill you, that's it. That means that person needs to fail. Otherwise, you're going to fail. So unfortunately, I mean, they were not in a situation of the realistically planning for any constructive negotiations. Russians want to destroy world order and Ukraine as a concept. That's it, plain and simple. And whoever is not understanding that is either naive or is unaware of the situation, or simply lives in a sort of environment where they're just waiting for to get back to the business as usual to keep making money with Russia. We need to make that illegal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Savidas, final question for you. Ukraine has survived another winter of the full-scale war, and we see Russia conducting these massive waves of airstrikes against their energy infrastructure. There were at least 4 massive attacks in the last 2 weeks. In late March, Kharkiv was left almost entirely without power following Russian attacks. How is Ukraine's energy supply faring post-winter and following these latest attacks?
Not well, unfortunately. I did speak to a number of companies last week, and one of the big power producers told me that they spent almost a full year trying to repair the damages that were inflicted in the winter of 2022-23. And within a couple of hours, Russia actually turned everything, two-thirds of these repair into a field of rubbish. This is exactly what the person told me. Luckily, Ukraine is connected to the European electricity grid, and it can compensate for part of the capacity loss with imports from neighboring EU countries. But the reality is that Ukraine needs to have its own capacity, and to be able to have this capacity, it needs air defenses. There is absolutely no way around that, and it's urgent. And failure or hesitation from the West to send these air defenses actually makes the West complicit in this in these Russian crimes. I'm sorry to say it, but this is critical life-saving infrastructure. Without this infrastructure, Ukrainians don't have access to electricity, don't have access to heating, don't have access to water. This is no joke, as was said before. And the longer the West delays sending these air defenses, the more vulnerable Ukraine becomes. And as someone was saying to me, they don't even know what to do because they would repair. But this is a Sisyphean task. You repair during the day and the Russians destroy everything at night. This is ridiculous. So yes, there is a strong need for urgent engagement from the Western partners.
Thank you very much. I've got my final two questions for our panelists, and I'll ask you to be brief as we have a lot of good questions from the audience. So Dr. Farkas, on March 22nd, ISIS committed a horrific terrorist attack in Moscow. The Kremlin's first impulse was to blame Ukraine, the US, and the UK for the attack. Days after ISIS claimed responsibility for the incident, the Kremlin has still been trying to tie the attack to Ukraine and the US. What's going on here, and what does the attack say about the competence of Putin's government to secure the Russian public against actual dangers?
Okay, Shelby, this is going to be hard to be succinct. But clearly, Vladimir Putin was looking for a reason to justify ongoing attacks against Ukraine, perhaps a new offensive. He certainly does, according to experts, need more manpower. The wives of people who have been at the front from the beginning of the full frontal assault, who are still alive, would like them to be rotated out. So there's pressure on him to keep the war machine going. So he was always going to need some excuse, some reason to rally the people behind him as much as he needed in order to basically provide the manpower he needs and to keep the war going. This attack by ISIS provided an opportunity to point a finger at Ukraine, but frankly, the Russians, I don't think they're fooled, most of them. Certainly the people in Moscow have to understand now that they are vulnerable in a way that they have not felt in a while. The fact that these men that they captured and interrogated and put on television are Tajiks, ethnic Tajiks. It's harder to explain than if they were ethnic Ukrainians. So I will just leave it at that. All of it points to the fact that this system, while it looks like Vladimir Putin's in control, it's a very brittle system, and he is not in control. He's probably, it's a contradiction almost, but he's probably at almost his weakest point, or maybe the weakest point was last summer when Prigozhin marched on Moscow, but he's still not back to where he was prior to that.
Thank you very much. And then Ambassador Herbst, you talked about the likelihood of the House finally passing an aid package for Ukraine. What else must the US do to secure its interests regarding this war? You are muted.
First, the White House needs to explain to the American public that Russia is our foe and we need to defeat Russia. Russia's conducting attacks on our officials with this Havana syndrome laser. They are doing cyber attacks against the United States. They are undermining our interests everywhere. So we have an interest in helping Ukraine defeat Putin. 1. 2, we have to stop self-deterring and sending the weapons Ukraine needs to win. If we send Ukraine everything that it is correctly asking for, longer range ATACMS, F-16s in quantity, tanks in quantity, electronic warfare, anti-mining equipment, Ukraine will win this war. Will win this war, and sooner rather than later. This would not just be good for Ukraine, it would restore American leadership, and maybe would help demonstrate to the entire American people that the way to make America great again is not to allow our enemy to steal a country in Europe.
Thank you very much. We are going to turn to audience Q&A. We have 7 minutes and a ton of questions, so let's go quickly. Ambassador Herbst, I'm going to turn the first question to you. This is from Colby Baudwire with The Insider. He says, why is it that after 1 year of Ukraine using British and French long-range cruise missiles effectively and responsibly, President Biden and Chancellor Scholz are still adamantly opposed to providing ATACMS and Taurus cruise missiles?
I think the answer is simple and sad. They have been intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats. The United States stood down the Soviet Union, which was a more powerful enemy than Putin's Russia is, over the Berlin crisis, over the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were not deterred from taking strong actions by nuclear tantrums. But the senior administration officials have said a dozen or so times they cannot do X or Y or Z, normally something relating to sending Ukraine weapons, because Moscow might escalate. We are a superpower too. We have the ability to inflict extraordinary damage on Russia as well. We should not be deterred from defending our interest by Putin's nuclear threats, even though we have to take into account his nuclear capability. That's the principal reason.
Thank you. Evelyn, a question for you from the excellent Jim Dolbo. He says, should NATO's allies surrounded by NATO empty out their inventory of 155mm shells and air defense platforms and send them to Ukraine? What other threat are they facing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question implies the answer. I mean, the number one military threat to our only collective security alliance, NATO, in the North Atlantic, is Russia. So if we understand, and I think the Baltic states, and Dr. Sabadus would probably agree, the Baltic states understand that they are probably next. So they have provided an amazing amount of weaponry, and they are probably getting close to emptying their stocks. Although, you know, again, we understand that it's incumbent upon us as NATO members to restock them. So I think we should be taking some risk there, because the number one threat is Russia. Of course, we have other threats looming over the horizon, but those are not immediate ones.
Thank you very much. Got a question from Mike Whitfield that I'll let anyone jump in on. He says, Andre is 100% correct. There's an extremely frustrating situation with U.S. Republican right-wing fringe elements. Their approval of U.S. aid may be in the form of a loan, not a grant. How will this obligation affect the actual physical flow and delivery of critical required weaponry? Any takers?
I'm happy to offer an initial response, so I thought Andre might have something to say as well. Look, it would be unfortunate if we need to go the loan route, but not a disaster. We can get everything to Ukraine as fast under a loan as under a grant. And we may be able to reconsider the terms of sending those weapons later in the day when the time, as we address it. But the most immediate need is to get those weapons to Ukraine, to stop Putin's advance and to push him out.
I can add that we passed there's been an act of lend-lease passed in the beginning of 2022, which hasn't been used since. There was an idea that that act would turn into some larger document by the middle or by autumn of 2022, which hasn't been done. So basically, it kind of was frozen. We can undust that paper and try to do that document and try to use it. It's absolutely possible, because we've been talking about a lease and the land lease for a while. So maybe that would be a solution, because that similarly sends us back to the history how it was back in World War II, which has been done through the Lend-Lease scheme. So as a potentially, but to be honest, I mean, for Ukraine it doesn't matter. We certainly would be happy if that is done through the Lend-Lease scheme or any other structure, as long as the support is ongoing. Because as was just discussed today, it's not just a matter on the battlefield, but it's also a matter of the protecting the civilian infrastructure. And the United States is a sole manufacturer of some systems which are not available in the other countries. So yeah, I think that we'll be fine with this option as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, we've got a question from Laurel Atkinson. She says, as President Zelensky has said he wants to establish a green energy market in Ukraine, and given the growing impact of climate change on global security, is this not an avenue whereby the Russian annexed oblasts present a basis of negotiating a political resolve to this war, i.e. that these oblasts with international support can be used to establish a green energy market relevant to both Ukraine and Russia? Supporting this initiative is that Russia has no credible green energy market, which is now widely understood to be the way of the future. If so, in a nutshell, which industry is the most critical to comprehensive global security? Defense industry or the green energy industry? Anyone?
I mean, it's probably not the right comparison. I mean, defense industry and the green industry, it's just like, I mean, how you can set up again one against the other. And defense industry is providing the fact that countries actually exist. So without the existence of the countries and without the existence of the stability, pretty much nothing else matters. However, obviously that doesn't mean that any other industry doesn't matter. Of course they do. So I don't think it's a correct question, to be honest. But thank you anyway.
Thank you. Dr. Salbit, is anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I agree. There's absolutely no no comparison between defense and green energy. I mean, and ultimately, Russia doesn't really care about green energy and the energy transition. It's one of the biggest methane emitter in the world. I mean, they don't care. All they care about is to sell their oil and gas, and that's it. I don't see I don't see a comparison, or it can't even be discussed, unfortunately.
I think that makes sense. Well, we are at time. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing your expertise and joining, and thank you to our audience. Keep an eye out. We will have more discussions on this topic, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.